Hello and welcome to the University of York Department of Archaeology Prospective Postgraduate Studies Seminar Series. Each episode features some of the fantastic staff we have here in the department. We're putting this series together to give prospective students a sense of who they will be learning from, what kind of research is happening, and to highlight what makes our department a uniquely wonderful place to undertake a master's degree. In this episode, we are going to hear about some incredible work in Mesolithic, Roman, and Viking archaeology, as well as some unique research in archaeology for sustainability. Enjoy!
Hello, my name is Nicky Milner. I'm a Professor of Archaeology here at the University of York, and I teach and research Mesolithic archaeology. I've always loved digging since my first taste of an excavation when I was still at school over 30 years ago, and today I'm going to tell you a bit about an excavation that I carried out at the site of Star Carr. Before I start though, I want to explain to you why I love the Mesolithic period. So the Mesolithic means Middle Stone Age. It's a period when people hunted, gathered and fished for their food, and before pottery and metals were used. So people relied on stone tools for their survival. The period starts at the very end of the last ice age at about 9,500 BC and lasts until about 4,000 BC and the start of the Neolithic period, when farming changed the way in which people lived and pottery was introduced into this country. What I find really fascinating about this period is that very little is known about it, perhaps because flint tools are often the only thing that survives on archaeological sites. It has attracted relatively little attention compared to other periods. However, for this period, people used flint to make axes to cut down trees and to make houses, as well as tools like digging sticks. They used the flint and the wood to make arrows, and they killed animals, and then used flint blades to butcher the animals, as well as using the bones and teeth to make other tools, the hides and sinews to make clothes and other items. They used flint and iron pyrite to make fires, and they would have sat in their houses and cooked food on their fires. And there are actually some sites where the conditions mean that all sorts of organic materials which wouldn't normally survive are found. So mainly wood and bone and antler. And these can give us a much better picture of how people were actually living at that time. But these sites are extremely rare and they're really hard to find, but they are incredibly important to our understanding of this period of the past. So one such site is in North Yorkshire. It's the site of Star Carr. It's very close to modern day Scarborough. And you can see here that at the time of the Mesolithic, there was a big lake there, which we know as Paleo Lake Flixton, and Star Carr was situated on this lake. But this is what the landscape looks like now. It's arable fields. It's a very different landscape to what it looked like in the Mesolithic. And through lots of research into this period and lots of research into the environment at this time, we're able to begin to put a picture together of what the lake would have looked like. So it would have been a lake like this map shows, and this has been revealed through augering through the peat. So taking an auger, pushing down until you get to the base of the peat, measuring the depth of the peat, and this then enables us to create this contour map which shows us the outline of the ancient lake. And what would the landscape have looked like? Well, probably something a bit like this. A lake fringed with reeds and trees in the wider landscape. So the site was found back in the 1940s by this man. This is John Moore. He was a local amateur archaeologist and responsible for one of the people responsible for setting up the Scarborough Archaeological and Historical Society. And he found the site by walking through the ditches and finding bits of bone and flint that were eroding out of the ditches. And he found about 10 sites like this. Starcar was the 4th one he found. And he got in touch with Graham Clark from the University of Cambridge, who at that time had just finished his thesis on stone tools from the Mesolithic. And he was looking for a site with waterlogged remains, a bit like some of the sites that have been found in Denmark, which were producing really exciting archaeology. And he thought that Starcar really had potential. And he came and dug at the site for 3 years. And because of this, the amazing archaeology that came out of the site, Starcar became very famous in the archaeological world, because of the wealth of rare and important finds that just hadn't been discovered in this country prior to that. And you can see on this slide one of these trenches, the depth of the peat that you have to get to before you get to the archaeological site. You've got a big tree in the base of this trench, and for scale you can just see a cow at the back, which looks like it might have even got into the trench and made a bit of a mess there. So I returned to the site in 2004 with Barry Taylor and Chantal Canella, and the 3 of us worked together on the site and its finds for a period of about 15 years. And this is an image of one of our last years of excavation there. You can see the big trench that we opened up, some of those waterlogged areas with the water still pooling in those, and the white tent like structure is over one of Clark's original trenches. There's a notable abundance of animal bone found at the site, something which wouldn't normally survive in normal conditions on many Mesolithic sites. But because the site had been located on a former lake and buried in peat, this excludes oxygen, so bacteria hasn't rotted away these artefacts. And in fact, in the lower layers of the peat, and you can see that the peat here, the very dark brown area, there are twigs and leaves and even pieces of moss which can be found, all looking as fresh as if it was still growing, even though it's 11,000 years old. The bone tells us about the animals which were around then. At this site there would have been a range of animals, including bear, elk, red deer, aurochs, which are wild cows, they're now extinct, roe deer, wild boar, dog, wolf, fox, badger, wildcat, pine marten, hare, beaver, hedgehog, and a range of birds such as geese, divers and grebe. And there are also pike and perch, fish in the lake. And many of these animals would have been eaten, but also a range of materials would have been used for other purposes as well. And in particular, we have evidence that their bones and antlers were turned into tools. Here you can see a section under that tent structure where Clark had been digging, but he'd just left a bulk, a little bit between trenches which hadn't been excavated, and we had the opportunity to look at that. And you can see how jam-packed it is, full of amazing animal bones and some little bits of wood. And so some of these bones and antlers from the animals were turned into tools. We have a large number of barbed points. These are barbed points here. These would have been hafted onto shafts, wooden shafts, to make arrows and spears and harpoons for hunting. But they're beautifully crafted out of antler and would have taken some time to manufacture. Also mattocks. So mattocks are made out of antlers, and these would have been used for digging, as would digging sticks, which have been made out of wood, and we found evidence for some of those as well. But for me, I think one of the most intriguing discoveries of the 1940s and 50s were those excavations was the discovery of antler frontlets, or sometimes known as antler headdresses, sometimes referred to as masks. And this is a picture of one of those. So these have been fashioned out of red deer skulls, and they would have taken quite a lot of work to get to this shape. We did some experimentation to try and see how they would have been made. We think that it's quite possible that clay, a bit of clay covering some of the antler and putting them on the embers of a fire would help break down the bone that you want to get rid of, and help create the shape that we see today with these headdresses. But taking off the bottom jaw, extracting the brain, all these things, there's a lot of process behind making one of these headdresses. They've been worked out of red deer skulls largely, although we do find roe deer skulls and think that those might have been used as some form of headdresses possibly too. And in all, 33 red deer antler headdresses have been found at the site, and there are none others known in this country at all, so they're incredibly rare, and only a handful of similar artifacts have been found in Germany, which shows some kind of link across a large area of northwestern Europe at this time. And we think that people probably wore them on their heads, as is being shown here with the replica, and here with a digital model that's been turned into a 3D print, and here one of our students experimenting with how they might have been tied on using perhaps hair. And we think that people probably did wear them on their heads. We have evidence from other places, this one from Siberia, that people do sometimes wear headdresses in shamanic rituals, and this engraving dates back to the 1700s and shows this person who's dressed up and banging a drum and taking part in a shamanic ritual. We also find beads made out of shale from the site, and the original excavations also produced some fragments of amber, which also would have been made into beads. And these are very rare objects again, and very beautiful objects. And one of the most amazing things that we found was this shale pendant with some intriguing markings scratched into it using flint. Now this is very small. You can see the scale. It's only about 3 centimeters across. It's a bit like a guitar plectrum really, and it's very thin as well. And you can barely see these markings with the naked eye. And certainly I can't see the very small little marks without my glasses or a magnifying glass to see it. So it's very interesting object with lots of questions associated with it. Now these geometric designs that we can see on it, and this photograph is just enhancing those a bit more. They're very typical of this period, known from many different artifacts in Denmark, but particularly on amber beads from Denmark. But it's very hard to know what they actually mean. Why are they making these marks on these objects? Are they tally marks, some form of counting? Is it some kind of form of communication? There have been many suggestions, and there probably will be many more suggestions in years to come as people look at this object and try and come up with their own interpretations. And you can see from this image here, we looked at it under the microscope, and you can see the sequence of markings that have been put on, probably in this kind of order. But it's not only artifacts that you can handle like that we uncover. At this site, we have evidence of structures, the evidence that people were building things, and in quite a big way. So in the waterlogged areas where the lake shore would have been, we have these incredible platforms which were constructed from long planks of wood, which would have been split and hewn using stone axes. And what's quite incredible here is this is the earliest evidence of systematic carpentry known in Europe. These really are quite astounding constructions, and they would have taken a lot of time and effort and teamwork to make. It's really hard to know what they were for. Here's a reconstruction of what it might have looked like at the time, with it just sort of on the edge of the water by the reeds. But are they being used to stabilise that part of the shore, to enable people to take boats out? Perhaps maybe they're fishing from these platforms. It's difficult to know because there aren't many artifacts associated with the platforms, so we have to think of the different possibilities. On the dry land part of the site, we've got evidence of houses, and this slide here shows the earliest evidence we have for houses in this country. So these were built by creating shallow hollows in the ground, probably through using digging sticks or the mattocks, and digging post holes around them. And although this is very ephemeral evidence, we can begin to get an idea of what they might have looked like. It's difficult to be sure, but we think it's likely that they were thatched with reeds because they're just by a reed swamp. And inside some of the structures, the flints demonstrate that people were making tools and probably processing animals within the structures, doing all sorts of different sorts of activities. And here's a reconstruction we've made at our experimental centre, which gives you an impression of what a Mesolithic house might have looked like. We can also learn a lot more about the climate environment from the peat which formed in the lake, because by coring through it, as this team are doing here, this is a team from Royal Holloway and the University of Southampton, and they're coring through and sampling for environmental remains, making it possible to reconstruct the climate and the trees and the plants which would have been present throughout the occupation of the site. And what's particularly interesting for Star Car is that it was occupied over a period of quite severe climate change. There was an abrupt climate event, and yet the people living there appear to have stayed there and largely demonstrated resilience despite these varying climatic conditions. And here we've got a graph showing the different climatic conditions through this period. So the first part where it's lower, that's the kind of the tundra-like conditions, the very cold period at the end of the last ice age. And you can see that there's very rapid climate change at the beginning of the Holocene period, followed by a few blips. And the picture of the woodland symbolises when the Mesolithic period sort of started. But you can see that climate is still changing, is still rising, and there's a lot of instability at this time. So remembering that we know so little about this period, sites like Star Car allow us to make all sorts of incredibly important discoveries that completely change our understanding of our ancestors. Whereas people used to think that hunter-gatherers would have moved around the landscape in small mobile groups, we now know they were capable of making substantial structures on the dry land and also on the edge of the lake. They had excellent craft skills, and they would have had belief systems and rituals, and they managed to survive through these difficult climatic conditions. Now, we still have lots of questions to ask, and we still don't know the answers to so many things, but this site has really hopefully given you a sense of how important Mesolithic archaeology is, how important waterlogged sites are, and that is just such a fascinating period. And there are still so many questions to answer, so many more discoveries to make. So I hope this has inspired you to learn more about the Mesolithic. You can see some of the artefacts in some museums, such as these headdresses. So these are in the Yorkshire Museum in York. And we have all sorts of resources online a website, an online course, and books, which are all downloadable for free should you want to do more research into this period.
Hello, I'm Maureen Carroll, Director of the MA in Roman Archaeology at the University of York. This MA programme is devoted entirely to the archaeology of the Roman world. It was designed and first delivered in 2020 and it has been going strong ever since, attracting students from all across Britain and from such diverse countries as India and Canada. In the coming year, 2 core modules will be taught: Roman Europe and Death, Burial and Commemoration in the Roman World. In addition to these 2 core modules, students will have the opportunity to take other modules such as Iron Age and Celtic archaeology, funerary archaeology, the archaeology of the human skeleton, and artifacts and materials analysis, to name just a few. At the core of the MA Roman Archaeology is the exploration of physical remains, material culture, and documentary sources that shed crucial light on status, mobility, the relationship between the inhabitants of the centre of the empire and those in the provinces, and the visual and material expression of cultural and ethnic identities in the Roman world, both in life and in death. Both core modules are delivered by me, but in the near future, my colleague Eva Mol will also be introducing modules that are integral to the programme. But you can read all about the MA programme, its structure, the core modules and optional modules, etc. in the online postgraduate information, so I don't want to spend too much time on that here. Instead, I would just like to give you a little taster of a couple themes and topics that we explore in the 2 core modules. One of those themes is migration, as we deal with it in the Roman Europe module. The other is the topic of memory, as we explore it in the Roman Death module. Migration in the past is a fascinating topic, and one that's very timely today, given the many circumstances that cause people to uproot and relocate themselves. For example, there is ample evidence in Roman Britain, particularly on the northern frontier, for soldiers and civilians from Syria living here, and we can see one of them in a Roman tombstone on the upper right. So this is not just a modern phenomenon. Some Roman authors made comments on immigrants and physical mobility in Rome and the wider empire. Here is, for example, Seneca writing in the 1st century AD. He says, "Look on these vast crowds for whom all the countless roofs of Rome can scarcely find shelter. The greater part of those crowds have lost their native land. They have flocked from their country, towns and colonies, and from all parts of the world. You will find that the greater part of them have left their own abodes and journeyed to a city which is not their own." Other documentary sources indicate that migration across the Roman Empire was frequent, and the map here shows you some red arrows indicating attested journeys of migration from one part of the empire to another. It simply was not uncommon anywhere. And we have most of our evidence, of course, coming from Rome itself. Here's another tombstone on the upper right of a man from Syria who happened to live and die in Rome in the 2nd century AD. What impact might migrants and external populations have had on the Romans? The Romans didn't think of race in the way that it might be linked with social signifiers today. They weren't particularly interested in skin colour, although, of course, these differences were noticed, as these depictions of Africans in various materials indicate. And it wasn't something that they wrote about much. They were more concerned about whether a person spoke Latin well or whether they had the right sort of social position or rank. Now, ethnic origins of some people who were physically mobile might be clear by their physiognomy, skin, or hair colour, etc. But language and dress will also have helped identify people's origins. I am particularly interested in something that is not often considered, namely how diverse Roman society was. And how would you, in the Roman period, have seen that it was so? Clothing and bodily adornment communicated ethnic and regional identities, as well as social standing and even religious orientation in a non-verbal way at one glance. This is one of the topics that we will explore on the module. Material culture can also shed light on migration and the movement of people. For example, utilitarian pottery from forts on the Antonine Wall in Scotland includes numbers of locally made vessels of ceramics, braziers, casseroles, all cooking pots with North African affinities. And so we can use the pottery found in Britain to reflect on the people who brought it with them, who continued to cook their food in the ways that they knew and enjoyed in North Africa. And we know that detachments sent from Britain to the North African War of Antoninus Pius in AD 146 to 149 may have brought people from North Africa back with them to Britain. And this might be a good piece of material evidence for that. Also, human remains are a source of information on mobility. The analysis of skeletons found in 2 cemeteries outside Rome, dating from the 1st to the 3rd centuries AD, for example, showed that 8 of the 150 people buried here were from places as far away as North Africa and the Alps. This is recognizable in the diet of course changing upon arrival in Rome in their new home, and this is reflected in the bones and teeth, which can be analyzed to detect diet and dietary changes. So these are some of the ways that we approach this multidisciplinary topic, and these are indications of how we discuss the topic on the MA Roman Archaeology, all aimed to help us understand migration in the Roman period. Another timely theme that we explore in the Roman death module is the role of memory, how it is perpetuated, how memory is erased, and how memory is sometimes constructed. The eradication of someone's memory through defacement or removal of images or removal of names from inscriptions is a very well documented Roman phenomenon that we see ongoing all around us today, if we just think of all of the statues that have been pulled down or defaced or removed for political reasons and for associations these people had with chapters in history that are deemed not very savory today. This happens today, but it certainly happened in the Roman world, and we can see a defaced Roman emperor's face in the middle and the names of someone disgraced from an inscription on the right-hand side. Particularly in regard to the memory of individuals, the location of Roman cemeteries, always along major roads leading into and out of settlements, is important, and the location was designed to offer ideal access to passing viewers and visitors alike. I show you here examples from Pompeii and Ostia. On the upper map, the green line indicates the zone of tombs located just outside the city walls of Pompeii. In green, the red tombs have been explored, and this is from the street, one of the streets of tombs on the lower left at Pompeii, and on the right, Ostia, entering the city on a major thoroughfare, the road being lined with tombs, as you can see here, on either side. On the front of built tombs and other burial markers was always a selection of carefully chosen pieces of information about the deceased, such as the person's name, place of origin, age, profession, family status, etc. Sometimes these inscriptions can, in one go, illuminate the lives of people about whom we otherwise know nothing, even though these people might have been important members of society at the time they lived. Such as the epitaph of Marcus Venerius Secundio from Pompeii, whose life from slavery to freedom and from poverty to wealth is recorded, along with his generous benefaction to the people of Pompeii. This is how he wanted to be remembered for posterity. Roman ideas about the afterlife are often quite confusing, as is the contradiction between acknowledging that someone is dead and buried, but still thirsty or hungry and requiring visitors to provide food and liquids to sustain them. We know this because of epitaphs on tombs that ask the passerby to come back and to give the deceased something to eat and drink because, as some of them say, we're still thirsty. So this seems to be a very contradictory situation, which we don't really understand entirely. But there's also provisions in cemeteries across the Roman Empire for pouring wine, oil, milk, honey down into a pipe located immediately above the buried remains of the deceased, so that the deceased will be fed and watered directly. Many tombs also were decorated with the physical likenesses of the dead. The dead and their memory could be preserved by the use of portraits, as you see here, full-length statues, and reliefs adorning the tomb inside and out. Furthermore, family relationships are commemorated in poignant ways, as on the carved lid of a marble sarcophagus on the upper left, where we see a man reclining and contemplating the portrait of his dead wife. Or a family at the lower right, mother, father, and son, who lie buried in the same tomb, but whose family connections is commemorated for eternity using this relief. But not only positive memories were preserved, also negative events and experiences could be recorded so that these would not be forgotten. This could include the murder of a wife by her husband, who was thereby shamed for all to see. As Prima Florentia says in her epitaph, she was murdered by her husband, who's here actually named and shamed, so that society would not forget that. And in Lyon in Gaul we see another woman who was killed by the cruelest husband. These are quite remarkable epitaphs. They're not that common, but they do exist. And they exist everywhere. So this module, as I hope is clear, draws on a wide variety of types of evidence to understand the importance of memory to the Romans and to explore many other themes related to death and burial. The MA in Roman Archaeology is also enhanced by activities outside the classroom every term. And here we are fortunate to be in York with its rich Roman heritage. In the last years, we have taken a tour through the remains of the Roman legionary fort under York Minster on the lower section in the middle, and we have discussed the lives of the dead through Roman tombstones in the Yorkshire Museum, upper right and lower right. Outside of York, we have taken an excursion to the Roman town of Aldborough on the upper left and seen the setting of the town, the material culture of the town, and the mosaics, an example of which I show you here. And we have looked at burial assemblages in the Doncaster Museum. These and other activities will continue in the coming years. I hope this has given you a taster of the kinds of themes and material we explore on the MA Roman Archaeology. And if any of this interests you and you have found it interesting, I look forward to seeing you on the MA programme in future.
Hello, my name is Steve Ashby, and I'm one of a growing horde of Vikings specialists at York. What makes our department really very special, I think, is its diversity. And whatever you're interested in the past, we've got something for you. That said, the department really does have some traditional strengths, not least in medieval archaeology. The department was set up by Philip Raats, who was really the founder of medieval archaeology in Britain and in Europe, perhaps. In recent years, we've really built on that legacy, and we're now, I think, one of the best places anywhere in the world, really, to study the archaeology of the Middle Ages. And that's particularly true regarding one particular area of interest, something that I'm very interested in, and something that York is very famous for, and that's the Vikings. And what I want to do today, just by thinking a bit about the Viking Age, is to show you how research and teaching at York brings together a really interesting mixture of traditional archaeology, archaeological science, public and community work, and digital archaeology as well. And I think that's a really unique approach. So we've got a real cluster of Vikings expertise here at York, something that I think is quite unusual and quite special. I specialise in Viking Age craft, trade, industry, that sort of thing, and I'm particularly interested in work that brings together England, Scotland, Ireland and Scandinavia. There's a whole army of staff, though, that work on the Vikings here in one way or another. This, for instance, is Alex McLean. She heads up our degree in medieval archaeology, and she looks at how sculpture and architecture changed through the time of the Vikings into the Norman period. This is David Orton, who's our zooarchaeologist, a specialist in animal bones. But he's got a project at the moment where he's tracking the movement of black rats across Europe in order for one purpose amongst many, is to better understand and retrace some of those medieval trade routes. This is our emeritus professor, Martin Carver, who you might know as the excavator of the very famous pre-Viking cemetery at Sutton Hoo. But he's also dug one of the few monasteries in Britain that you might argue has compelling evidence for Viking raiding. And this is Gareth Perry. He's our artifact specialist, and he's busy reinventing the way we look at Viking pottery in particular, but also with an emphasis on things like experimental archaeology, so another area of our curriculum which ties into our study in Vikings. And what's important to understand is that what we teach and research at York is very much a team effort. My own work relies on the collaboration of artifact specialists, osteologists, excavators, biologists and chemists. So actually, the list of people who have written about the Viking Age at York is much longer even than this here. And we teach from our research. This is just a selection of books that have been produced by staff at the department and staff who were at the department until recently, produced in the field fairly recently. And as we're writing this material, we use it in our lectures, so you're getting brand new research right from the horse's mouth. Now, today I was tasked with talking about my own work about the Viking Age, but I thought what I'd do first is mention some of the fantastic work being done by others in the department, from my other colleagues. And you'll see then a picture, I think, of how work at York has really started to kind of change the way we think about the Viking Age. So this is Professor Julian Richards. Julian's made a phenomenal contribution, really, to the understanding of the Vikings in England. He dug at York's famous Coppergate excavation, the basis for the Viking Centre in York. He's also the excavator of one of Britain's only known Viking military cemeteries, as well as its only real excavated Viking farm. And you'll learn about all of this if you come to study at York. Now, some of his work made press quite recently, when a reanalysis of some of the animal remains from a Scandinavian cemetery in Derbyshire, which was actually excavated by our own students a few years ago. A reanalysis of some of the animal bones from this site showed that the Vikings were bringing in dogs and horses from Scandinavia. We did genetics, DNA research was done on these bones. That showed us where these animals came from. And that wasn't something that we'd been able to demonstrate before. This was, to give you some context, was probably a military cemetery related to what we call the Viking Great Army, which is a kind of a complicated kind of group of Scandinavians and people from other countries travelling around England, Britain, Ireland, parts of Europe at this time in the 9th century, and really being really kind of formative to what happens throughout the rest of the early medieval Britain. And this is something that Julian continues to work on. And in particular with Professor Dawn Hadley, another of our colleagues here, he's currently working on one of a very small number of identified Viking military camps. These are the places the Great Army stayed when they were campaigning around the country. In particular, Dawn and Julian have been working with metal detectorists, so amateur hobbyists, and working with them to make sense of the data that they produce, finding where they found their finds, seeing what that tells us about the landscape. And through doing this, they've managed to identify a Viking camp in a place called Torksey in Lincolnshire. And by studying this, they've shown that these sites weren't quite as we thought they were previously. They were much bigger, much more complicated than we thought they were. They must have looked something like small towns, perhaps something like music festivals, something like that. And they weren't just for warfare. People were buying and selling things. They were making things there. They were trading. They were working with melting down metal. And also, no doubt, they were gambling. They found thousands of gaming pieces at Torksey. And now we know what these sites look like, these sites are starting to pop up everywhere. And the Great Army is starting to look a lot more visible and a lot less mysterious than it once was. This, again, is something you'd study if you did our medieval archaeology degree here. And it's something which Julian and Dawn together have really started to kind of change in terms of perceptions of the Vikings in England. But of course, York is also well known for its digital approach to heritage, and we've attempted to use some of those ideas in working with these Viking sites. One piece of work that Dawn and Julian have been involved in is trying to visualize what these Viking camps might have looked like using VR. And doing this, they produce experiences for the public to engage with in museums. So here you can see some little VR displays of shipworking, shipbuilding, metalworking, gambling, and a range of other activities. It's all closely based on the archaeological evidence because the Viking specialists here work so closely with the digital team, quite an important part of our approach. And this focus on talks brings us to another member of our staff that I mentioned earlier, Gareth Perry, who's been looking in detail at the pottery made at Torksey. This becomes one of the really kind of important pottery production sites of the later Viking Age. And by looking at pottery, you used it to try to work out what it might tell us about life, about craft, about identity in this part of Viking England. For example, by looking closely at the pottery in the cross-section, he's been able to demonstrate that little old Torksey in Lincolnshire was feeding this mighty city of York with its pottery. York wasn't producing its own pottery, it seems. It was importing a lot of it from Torksey. Why might that be? It's an interesting question. We don't yet know the answer to. It might be political, it might be economic, but we get at it by looking in small detail, tiny detail, at things like pottery. And that's something that Gareth is really taking the lead on. But this pottery is a brand new form of ceramic that comes in at this point, very different to what's being used in Anglo-Saxon England before, probably something which is being introduced by the Great Army itself. And that's, again, something that Gareth's interested in. But that led me to a question about what these pots are being used for. If we're getting a brand new range of pots coming in, why is that? Are they being used to cook in new ways too? Can we see the influence of new Scandinavian or new continental ways of cooking, new cuisines? And this is a project that I've been working on trying to answer it. So by looking carefully at the pots, at the patterns of wear, the patterns of burning, and working with our colleagues in BioArc to establish what was being cooked in these pots, we're trying to find out whether these new forms of pots related to new ways of cooking. And it's clear from what we've done so far is that the relationship between pottery type and cooking style is really complicated. It's not straightforward at all. And that's probably to be expected given the diverse populations of these Viking towns. So what we've seen is this sort of expression of various scales of identity, urban identities, perhaps ethnic identities, statuses reflected in the diet and the way that people are cooking. So this interest in the Vikings in England is, of course, one of our real strengths at York. But I've actually spent a lot more of my time researching the Vikings in their homelands back in Scandinavia. So that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time I've got today. So this object you can see here, this started out life as a fitting on a book from a monastery, probably in Britain or Ireland, but it was found in Norway in a woman's grave. And on the back of it, there's a pin and a catch blade showing that this piece of book fitting is actually turned into a brooch. So what does this mean? Why are Vikings stealing things like church furniture and turning it into jewellery? I think this is a way of referencing voyages overseas. These items might even have been involved in storytelling, perhaps, as ways of passing on the stories and the mythologies that held together the power networks of Viking Age Scandinavia. And that's why I think that the Viking raids might have taken place in the first place anyway. The question of how they started is another interesting issue that I'm interested in. And one of the biggest debates about the Viking Age is a kind of chicken or egg question. Does raiding eventually turn into trade? Or does shipping technology and skills designed for long-range trade eventually get co-opted for violent means? So do Vikings, people in Scandinavia, are already travelling around by boat, and then they see an opportunity to take things by violent means, or does the whole thing come together as one kind of big bang? And this is something that people have been talking about for a long time. I think now this is something that we can say that we've sort of solved. These objects, something that I'm very interested in, that I've been working on for 20 years, hair combs, or rather, this sort of exciting looking debris produced in the comb making process. So how does this work, you might be asking? Combs are made of deer antler. Different species of deer live in different parts of the world. So if we can identify the species that combs are made of in different areas, we can track long distance movement. And in particular, we can use combs to track contact with the Arctic North. This is the distribution of reindeer. You can see on this map here on the left. As you can see, it exists entirely in upland areas of central and northern Scandinavia. So any reindeer antler found down here in Denmark or even further south must be imported. And the distances mean that it must represent long distance sea travel, ship travel basically. So I spent a happy summer in Denmark cutting up tiny pieces of combs and comb waste for analysis. We then brought these samples back to our bioarc facility in York, where we subjected them to a process of called ZOOMS, Zoo Archaeology by Mass Spectrometry. You don't need to know the detail of that now. You can find out more about it if you come here to York. But it basically allows us to distinguish between different species using absolutely tiny samples. And importantly, it easily distinguishes between red deer and reindeer. And we looked at several sites, but most important of these was a site called Ribe, which is Scandinavia's oldest and probably my favourite Viking town. It has been excavated by a former York colleague, actually, a former lecturer at York, Søren Sundbæk, who's still a close collaborator of mine. The sequences here are incredibly fine and close dated, which allows us to date individual phases to just sort of 10-year periods, which is quite unusual for this time period. This means that we can date find the date at which reindeer antler first arrives in southern Scandinavia. And it turns out that it arrives well before the start of the Viking Age, in the earlier 8th century. So this was the earliest evidence for contact with the Arctic we had, and clearly showed that Scandinavians were travelling around the North Sea for trade well before they started raiding. And this made quite a lot of press, and I think it changed the way we started to think about the way that the Viking Age began. And we've since applied this to other areas, and we've applied this technique to combs and manufacturing waste across Scandinavia, England, Scotland, Germany, the Netherlands, and even Iceland and Greenland. And we've studied the combs from a famous pre-Viking ship burial in Estonia too, a lot of this work being led by a PhD student of mine. And we're soon going to start working on material from Poland and I hope Ireland as well. So the idea is to start to draw a new map of the Viking world, looking at movement and connectivity as expressed through this new form of evidence, deer antler. And it's already telling us quite a lot about the organisation of trade networks, and will also tell us a lot about human migration and population movement, I think. And this is what I'm really interested in, how you can answer some of these really big questions by looking at small objects, and in particular by looking at them at tiny detail using archaeological science. It's this paradox, the kind of coming together of the very small and the very big, which is really interesting, I think. That's where we find all our answers. So hopefully what I've shown to you today is how over the course of just the last 5 years or so, 5 or 10 years, our understanding of the Viking Age has changed in several important ways. Back in Scandinavia, it's much clearer now when the Viking Age started, how it started, and why it started. In England, we've got a better understanding of the scale and the character of the early military activity in England, what those first raids, first military campaigns looked like, and the ways in which those campaigns turned into settlement, leaving a Scandinavian legacy in food, in pottery, in urbanism. And all of these findings have emerged at York through work undertaken by our staff and very frequently involving our students as well. And just to finish off, to give you a particular example of this, I've been involved in a lot of work thinking about how craft was organised, how people made things. And that's led me to work not just with other artefact specialists, but also with historical craft workers, people who still make some of these objects today. And several of those craft workers have actually become our students. This here is Jim Gluzzard. Jim's was known to me first as a comb maker. He's now a very successful metal worker. And he came to us to do the MA in material culture and experimental archaeology. He's now doing a PhD with us on Viking Age metalworking. And he's currently building a Viking Age metalworking workshop over at our experimental archaeology centre, the Year Centre. And we really encourage this sort of work, and we'd love for you to get involved in these sorts of projects for dissertations, for little research projects, and just for fun as well, just to help out and try out lots of different things. And because we're such a lively centre of research activity, there's a lot more you can get involved in too. From talks by authors of historical fiction, to Viking cookery, to Metal Friday, which is an event we put on a few years ago, where we interviewed and had a private audience with big names in the world of Viking and folk metal music. So it's a really lively place, very interdisciplinary place where you can try lots and lots of different stuff. And we also work hard to communicate our findings with the public. So if you search YouTube, you'll see a lot of TV and radio programs we've been involved in recently. These are a good way of finding out a little bit more about the stuff that's going on at York. And we do also have a look at our own departmental YouTube channel, which I manage. So there's plenty of medieval content up there. But please remember, what I've given you today is just my side of medieval archaeology at York. We could do an entirely different presentation on the archaeology of the Norman conquest, on late medieval churches, on castles, towns, craft guilds, that sort of thing. These are all areas that we really specialise in at York, and something that you'll get the chance to find out all about and to research here as a research student, as a postgraduate student. So if you have any questions, please do just drop us a line. I would say that's the end, but let's hope for you that's the beginning. Thanks very much, and hope to see you next year.
Hello there, my name is Adam Green and I am a lecturer in sustainability here at the University of York. I am an archaeologist, but I also sit in the Department of Environment and Geography. I work in both departments to look for ways that archaeological data can contribute insights and knowledge that can help address challenges in the present. I have worked for the past 10 years in the agricultural landscapes of Northwest India, the image that you see here. This is a region that produces 2 staple crops in the year and actually contributes to the food security of billions of people. However, this agricultural landscape didn't emerge overnight. It is the product of landscape transformations that go back nearly 5,000 years. People first started farming in this region during a pre-urban phase in 3300 BC. These early agro-pastoral communities were so prosperous that there was actually an urbanization period that occurred around 2600 BC, giving birth to the Indus civilization, home to some of the world's first cities. However, Indus cities didn't last forever, and after a post-urban Chalcolithic phase, there was a de-urbanization in response to climate changes or a weakening of the Indian summer monsoon. The periods between the Indus civilization's deurbanization and the later massive landscape transformations that we see as a response to British colonialism isn't so well understood. However, these are areas that we can use archaeological data and insights to gain a better understanding of, and those understandings can, on their own way, help us structure responses to modern day challenges. So today I'm going to step you through 3 basic areas of my research. First, I'm going to discuss ways archaeologists define sustainability, ways archaeologists engage with broader discussions of sustainability. Then I'm going to give you a little bit more of a deep dive into the agricultural landscapes of Northwest India. Finally, I'm going to talk about some preliminary insights into modern day global challenges that we can get from understanding these agricultural landscapes and discuss how we can use them to make interventions in the present. So without further ado, let's get into thinking about sustainability and thinking about what archaeology has to say to sustainability. Sustainability in South Asia is quite an interesting topic. The region is incredibly environmental diverse. Here you can see a map of the Köppen-Geiger climate zones that characterize South Asia today. You can see actually a huge clash between semi-arid rainfall systems that bring a lot of water during the winter months. These rainfall systems actually charge water courses that then flow through massive alluvial basins that have been home to agricultural landscapes for millennia. But you also have this monsoonal rainfall system you can see sweeping across the Indian Peninsula in pink and red here. So red is where areas of heavy rainfall, and then pink is areas that are generally considered dryland. So there's areas where most of the water has to be captured from the Indian summer monsoon. What's interesting is that these different regions are home to many, many different variations of agropastoral practices, those that change and were very different in the past. However, all this diversity, which gave rise to different Neolithics, different subsistence practices, different empires, different polities, all these differences are superseded today by a single system of monocropping, wheat and rice agriculture that characterizes all of South Asia today. That is, all this diversity in the past has actually been replaced by what are effectively monocropping systems in the present. Now, the institution of these systems was vital to securing Indian food security in the 20th century. But they also brought with them a range of different ecological challenges, such as a dramatic decline in groundwater levels, particularly in the Green Revolution zones here in Northwest India. Incidentally, also the areas that gave rise to the first Bronze Age cities in South Asia. These are areas where aquifers are declining rapidly, wells are being used more intensively, and food security is becoming under threat. These are also areas that are facing increasing aridification due to contemporary climate change. Because these areas have deep archaeological histories, they allow archaeologists to make interventions into sustainable development goals. In 2015, the UN adopted a set of 17 objectives for sustainable development. These SDGs encourage countries to undertake projects that reduce inequality and soften the impact of human activities that degrade our environments. These goals have formed the blueprint for legions of social scientists and economists who have embraced, critiqued, and challenged the goals. However, their work has been hindered by the timeframes of the data that are most often available to them. Most social science and economics is constrained to data sets collected only over the last 30 or 40 years, or within the context of the contemporary climate crisis. Their work and perspectives are therefore fundamentally incomplete. I believe, and other scholars at the University of York believe, that archaeology can provide a solution, or can at least help provide a solution, to this presentist bias. This is why I think archaeologists should engage directly with sustainability research like that gave us the Sustainable Development Goals and help develop specific research projects that help design them. Today, I'll discuss in particular how patterns in landscape archaeology bring with them the particular scope to draw on variation in the past or assemble long-term data sets that may help us address some of these climatic challenges and bolster food security, reduce inequality, and encourage innovation and infrastructure development in the present. Archaeology in South Asia is particularly well positioned to do this because of that variation I alluded to before, something that derives from these complex environments that stretch across South Asia. South Asia is also home to many millennial-scale data sets. That is, we can trace patterns of urbanization and deurbanization that have unfolded over thousands of years. These data sets document agricultural cycles that can help us, that are best understood at a landscape scale, best understood by looking at the connections between people and places and how those connections change through time. We can use these data sets to identify patterns and insights for agricultural programs and interventions. This is good because in India, there's a thirst for heritage-based agricultural practice. Applying archaeological insights to sustainability interventions is not straightforward. This was my aim while I worked on the Global Challenge Research Fund's Tigris project, which combined archaeology and economic and agronomic data sets, along with the work produced by various NGOs, to bring archaeology together with other disciplines and integrate data from the past with intervention strategies in the present. Here you can see a range of different, what I call lessons from the past or patterns from the past that can be used to derive lessons that address current sustainability challenges. So you can see here 3 sustainability challenges, including reservoir mismanagement, land leveling and canal construction, and rice and wheat monocropping. And you can see that they're all discontinuities that stand in contrast to long-term patterns we can document in the archaeological record. Things like temple reservoir control, imperial surface water management, inter-village reservoir management, settlement distributions, village ponds, and high crop diversity. These are patterns in the landscape that change in the contemporary period and present dangers to sustainability. They can therefore be used to identify particular lessons from the past, things like bottom-up management of resources, efficient water use, top-down investment in the development of resources, water capture and conservation technologies, adaptations to local environments, so that is taking advantage of that environmental and ecological diversity I showed you earlier, and crop diversity and flexibility. These are specific lessons that apply to interventions that can be carried out in the present. Things like building community participation programs, developing local water monitoring, providing subsidies that lower energy use, and hopefully generate new sustainable patterns from the future. Hopefully we can plop some green bars on these red bars in the not too distant future. All right, so that gives you an idea of how, as an archaeologist, we can engage with sustainability research and how we can engage with the sustainable development goals. What does the archaeology of South Asia, what does the archaeology of Northwest India actually say about agricultural sustainability? To get at this question, we actually have to do some environmental and landscape archaeology. So let's turn to the agricultural landscapes of Northwest India. So we'll shift to the results of an ERC-funded project that tried to reconstruct the relationship between past environments and the Bronze Age urbanization that I mentioned earlier. One key component of this project was developing remote sensing data sets that allow us to understand where water was and wasn't during the Bronze Age. Here you can see the culmination of a remote sensing project that combined a huge range of different remote sensing data sets. STRM, SMTVI, developed all kinds of combined data from all kinds of different periods, all kinds of different satellite missions, and used a machine learning algorithm to identify areas where there were likely watercourses in the past. So what you can see is that by combining all of these different surface vegetation data sets combining them with topographic data sets, there's actually a number of small paleochannels evident in the region where urbanism emerged in northwest India. However, it's not just one river. There's actually a very complex network of thousands of kilometers of paleochannels, all of which could have provided water sources to agricultural communities in the past. These paleo environments, however, don't tell us anything about agricultural landscapes unless we combine them with data about past human settlement. Here is a study that took the site locations that had been assembled over decades of archaeological landscape research in northwest India and attempted to place past settlement processes within their environmental context. You can see there are all kinds of vagaries in the archaeological data set. Some areas have been surveyed in great deal, other areas haven't been surveyed at all. However, laying out which parts of the landscape we know about their past settlement distributions and those that we don't know is actually the fundamental first step toward carrying out new fieldwork, which has been another big part of my research, identifying the location of settlements that were occupied at different periods in the past. Over about 5 years, my team and I, we're working with Dr. Aftab Alam and myself, we surveyed over 300 ancient settlements located across an incredibly wide range of different environments in northwest India. So these are settlements, these are basically ancient villages that were occupied during different periods in the deep history of agricultural landscapes in northwest India. So these basically reveal places where people formed settlements to take advantage of different water courses, like those you've seen reconstructed in the paleo data on the slide earlier. Assembling these landscape data sets is particularly useful for understanding the deurbanization period that occurred in 2600 BC, as ostracod records reveal a weakening of the Indian summer monsoon in northwest India. So what do the settlement location data sets actually tell us about this key transition in the past? Well, we can compare the urban phase settlement distribution, which you see here. Hotspots are areas where there are lots of past settlements. You can see they're kind of aligning to the location of past watercourses, but some settlements are actually found in areas where there are no clear examples of past watercourses. And we can examine the transition between this 2600 to 1900 BC time slice and the post-urban Chalcolithic phase, where there's a movement out of the cities, where Indus-cities were abandoned, and people begin taking advantage of a wider range of water sources in their environments. So just to recap, during the urban phase, this is what the agricultural landscape looked like. Lots of settlements around the city, mostly on watercourses, some distributed in different parts of the environment. However, when the city of Rakhigarhi was abandoned, suddenly there's a huge uptick in settlement in certain locations, and there's generally a de-watercoursesization of the agricultural landscape. Basically, people are relying on water sources that are different from those watercourses they used during the urban phase. So, what does this transition tell us about sustainability? What do we find from this transition from watercourses to non-watercourses, from urbanization to deurbanization, that can help us guide sustainable development or help us achieve sustainable development goals in the future? Well, one of the things that comes out of this research is an emphasis on village ponds or interfarm ponds. If different Bronze Age communities are leaving behind water sources fed by watercourses, what are they using? The short answer is ponds like these. These village or interfarm ponds are distinct from things like canals, wells, or watercourses. They're prevalent in the Bronze Age, but they seem to become more important all the way through to the colonial period. There's an interesting piece of research by the environmental historian Tushar Shah that says that prior to British colonial interventions, pre-colonial adaptive irrigation characterized the landscape. That is, farming communities were left to establish their own water supplies and manage their own irrigation supplies, generally as long as they were self-sufficient and could pay their taxes. What's interesting is this particular form of small-scale surface water management represents kind of a basic level of collective action. That is a basic level where small communities would have to come together and manage their environmental resources. This accords with a broader range of environmental and ecological and political theories surrounding the study of collective action. That is saying collective action is an effective way of managing common pool resources because everyone has an awareness of what the resource is, where it stands, and they have to come together to agree rules on how to manage it. So small surface water ponds appear to have been an effective scale of collective action for managing surface water in the past. I'm happy to say that this research has been hugely interesting to government authorities interested in what to do about the locations of surface water sources in the present. Here's an image from a stakeholder meeting I held with the Punjabi government in early 2020 prior to the pandemic lockdowns. There was a great interest in restoring village ponds or using ponds to supplement things like well irrigation, which was rapidly depleting the aquifer. There's even some hydrological research to indicate that the establishment of more rain-fed interfarm ponds or village ponds could help restore aquifer levels and improve the sustainability of agriculture in this green revolution zone. However, this research is just at the beginning. There's now big discussion about the revival of different village ponds, and there's also huge interest in taking advantage of past crops that use less water and are more resistant to environmental challenges. All right, this has been a quick tour of the ways archaeology can contribute to sustainability in the future. I showed just briefly how archaeology can engage with definitions of sustainability. I introduced the agricultural landscapes of Northwest India and talked about some of the challenges facing farmers there and how they've changed over thousands of years. And finally, I've introduced some preliminary ideas about how collective action and water management can benefit from archaeological data and can be used to address challenges in the past. Please don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed listening to those presentations. If you'd like to find out more, please have a look at our degree pages or follow us on social media with the links below, and we hope to see you here in York. Take care.